I'd like to approach the question, how many languages can we afford with, I'll start with a personal anecdote. I think that's always a smart thing to do. When I started studying classics, reading Latin and Greek philology, I felt I could afford 4 languages: German, English, Ancient Greek, and Latin. So naturally, my first module was on Latin love poetry, and it turned out that a really important book on that subject was written in French. I saw my professor and told him I can't read this, and his response was, "No problem, here's a French dictionary, get on with it." Now, I've often asked myself over the last few years what would happen if I did this in a classroom here. Not necessarily in Reading, but in the UK. We probably would have a grievance case on our hands because it's not in the learning outcomes and it's not in the module description that you need to know any other language. But what does this actually mean? The way I see this is, if I hadn't got my head around this French publication, which turned out to be really good actually, there would have been a lack of knowledge on my side. In the long run, there would have been a lack of capability and probably a lack of value and competitiveness in myself as a student, both within the discipline and beyond. Now, classics is one of those subjects where you still need to know quite a few languages, because if you go to an international event, you will rarely experience a situation in which English is the only language spoken by all participants. That may be unusual in academia. I'm fully aware there are quite a few disciplines out there where English is the only language spoken regardless of where you are. But I think classics in a way is also actually quite a realistic reflection of what is going on in the real world. And just to give you an example of how perverse this actually can seem to academics and students in other countries, well, it seems pretty obvious that you study, for example, the subject of English literature in English, reading English texts and discussing about this in English and reading about it in English specialist publications. So how about studying English literature exclusively in German translation, exclusively based on German research? It feels something is wrong about that. Even to me, as a native speaker of German, it somehow feels wrong. That as an introduction. Today I should be talking about my own research and how this can feed into the overarching debate. As Esther said, I'm a Latin scholar, and I will be looking a bit at the development, at the linguistic development in the Mediterranean basin. When we look at what we now would prefer to call Italy, so the Apennine Peninsula in the 5th century BC, I conducted a quick count this morning. There were about 21, 22 languages spoken just on that one peninsula. One of them was Latin, and if you enjoy that, I'll just quickly read out the other ones, so I haven't done this in vain. Lepontic, Gaulish, Rhaetic, Venetic, Ligurian, Etruscan, Umbrian, North Picene, South Picene, Faliscan, Sabine, Vestinian, Aequian, Pelignian, Marrucinian, Marcian, Volscian, Oscan, Messapic, Greek, Sicanian, and Sicel. 21, 22 languages, you do the maths. About 2 of them survive. One of them in a modified version in the Romance languages, if we see that as survival of Latin, and the other one being Greek, as in modern Greek. And all of these languages were actually distinct languages. You might prefer to call some of them dialects rather than sort of distinct languages, but we're not talking about mere regional variation. It's not sort of the English spoken in Greater London versus the English spoken in Yorkshire. There are quite significant differences. So a question one might ask a second-year undergraduate at this point: how come Latin survives and Etruscan dies? How come people in the Romance-speaking world speak Romance and not a dialect based on Etruscan? It's a very difficult, highly speculative question to answer, but I could give you another example in which it's fairly obvious why the situation has developed as it has. Why don't we speak Punic? I won't bore you with the history of the Punic Wars now, even though I really should, just to feel better myself. But obviously, here we had a clash of cultures, of sort of economic competitors at some point, and the result, if Hannibal had been a smarter person, could have been rather different. The history, the linguistic reality of Europe could have been rather different if that elephant episode had worked out differently. So essentially what we see here is Punic didn't extend to Europe, but Latin moved into North Africa. So as a result of warfare, of expansionism, we may even call it imperialism if you like, that has helped to shape something in the European linguistic landscape. And I think looking at the development of the linguistic landscape in the Mediterranean and those few centuries BC, the factors that seem to have driven the development, in my view, are maybe three. At what time did the Romans encounter their opponents in their history? To what extent was that area colonized and sort of became part of the Italian mainland? And how did the inhabitants, the original populace, respond to that act of aggression or expansion? So the Etruscans, being unfortunately the direct neighbors and the people who ran the city in the first few centuries, had probably rather different problems to face in response to that development than, say, the Greeks. It helped that obviously the Romans thought that Greek culture was something worth preserving as well, but they did not take the same effort to get rid of the language. So what we see when looking at the linguistic reality of the ancient world, focusing on the Romans and the development and the spread of the Latin languages, we see areas that fairly quickly become monolingual. But we see areas in which Latin remains one language among at least two, maybe even more. And we see areas in which Latin never really catches on. The Greek East, well, Latin seems to be the language of the army, of the administration, the language you put on imperial inscriptions, but it's not the language that would be used in everyday communication. And looking further down the line and see how Latin develops sort of across time and space, we see that it sort of eventually pulverizes and sort of develops into Proto-Romance and then sort of the Romance languages in some parts, and of course in North Africa we see eventually Arabic taking over, which again obviously is an act of expansionism driving the linguistic reality here. Now the later development of Latin, in my view, goes to prove, at least for this one occasion, I mean that's a question we might want to debate actually, if a single language across a vast territory is actually something that can remain sustainable. I would argue the example of Latin and sort of the disappearance of Latin has shown that it's not sustainable. And you might wonder if there are parallels to be drawn to modern languages. What about the diverse development of the world Spanishes or the world Englishes? Is that sort of already the first step towards the disappearance of the English language? Now, Esther introduced this with the question, how many languages can we afford? I find it very hard to quantify the cost of multilingual life in antiquity. I don't think we have the sources to make any informed suggestion here. But I think if we don't just think in economic terms, history goes to prove, at least in Europe, at least in that one time period, that the idea of universal monolingualism would have to be forced upon humankind and is of non-durable, non-lasting nature. And I think the study of a dead language as a paradigm also shows that there are just too many factors beyond the control of language policy that in fact drive the development of a living language. It's a complex system in motion that is practically impossible to stabilize. So I would make the point, just try this out for the debate, that a lingua franca is eventually said to die out. So the question is not how many languages can we afford. I'd prefer the question, how many languages can't we afford? And that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much.